detail. So I'm not going to go into details now again. You remember, like I was discussing about the maintenance contracts for the airlines? Yeah? Okay, now some practical challenges which we have somehow identified at Deutsche Post level. Yeah, so at Deutsche Post level, when we had this IFRS 16 implementation, we were talking about somehow like more than 20,000 contracts, yeah, and more than 50,000 assets. So this cannot be captured on Excel, absolutely not. This in 220 countries, analyzing different lease contracts. So for the big companies, at least also in Pakistan, if you have thousands of contracts, yeah, you need some kind of database to manage all that. So in Deutsche Post level, like what we have done, we have now developed a SAP based tool, which is a lease application. It has a flexibility of uploading all the lease contracts. So every country is responsible to upload the lease contracts. Then it has certain fields, yeah, where you define that what was the start date, what are the lease rentals, what are the different renewal options, and if management assessment whether you want to avail the renewal option or not, you know. So all this is somehow captured into a database, which in the end, based on the defined rules under IFRS 16, will somehow generate the accounting bookings for us. Yeah. So also lease accounting is not simple, right? If you are dealing with an entity and an accountant sitting in Angola, what kind of knowledge level would you expect, right? So that is the reason, yeah, we at the group level, we said, okay, let's try to make it simple and somehow make it more easier for the companies to manage, right? And that is now linked to our ERP system, so it will generate the monthly bookings. Other important aspect is like to manage all that, you need someone who has good knowledge of lease standard, right? If our operations department is executing a lease contract, for them it's a simple contract, right? They will not understand the complications which this contract can bring to our financial statements. So that's why for every particular entity, you need some kind of a person or a resource who is capable enough, who can really understand the lease terms, the contract terms, who can identify whether it's a lease or not lease, what kind of renewal options are there, you know, what should be the value which it has to be capitalized on the balance sheet. So at Deutsche Post DHL level, we have somehow introduced a role of a lease coordinator, at least on the regional level, and also for all the big companies, big countries. Yeah. So his role is, or his function is to coordinate with all the other departments. Whenever there is an agreement, it is reviewed by the lease coordinator. He decides whether this agreement should be in our lease database or not. Yeah? Okay, the other thing is like also this requires a bit of tailoring on into our payments and payable processing systems as well, because if we have identified a new role as a lease coordinator, then this gentleman also has to, or lady has also be to involved in the payment process, right? So also one thing which we have to keep in mind. Other complication here is also that, for example, if we have a lease database, that will only capture the valuation for your balance sheet for right of use asset and lease liability, but the variable rentals are not part of your right of use asset and lease liability, but they are part of your supplier invoice, right? So supplier is not going to invoice you separately for variable rents and for the fixed rents. He will simply issue one invoice that your flight hours were this much, so this is my cost and this needs to be paid, right? So then it's a bit of complication in reconciling these two systems, right? From your leasing database, the fixed committed rental will be generated as a right of use asset and the lease liability. However, the supplier invoice covers both the elements, the variable rentals and also the fixed rentals. Somehow practical limitation, especially for the payables team. Yeah. So one entry will be generated from the lease database, which is your right of use asset and the lease liability, and one is generated by receiving the actual invoice from the supplier, right? Yes? Okay. Some learning points also, like IFRS 16 will have implications on your chart of accounts. You need to create new chart of accounts, new accounts for the right of use assets, right of use liabilities. You need to create new P&L accounts for the variable lease rentals, short-term leases. Then also we need to create certain new note positions. Reconciliation process can also be a challenge between the payables ledger and the lease bookings. And also for the controllers, the Kpis adjustments. Yeah, for example, at the Deutsche Post level, we monitor the operational cost per move. Yeah, our operational costs per move. So earlier these lease rentals were part of my transportation cost, and now these will flow into my depreciation and interest. So my year-on-year comparison will look really bit strange. Yeah, so because part of my cost is now under EBIT, below EBIT, which is the interest element, and also the account classification has also changed. So for us also in the budgeting exercise and then also in the controlling exercise, it was a bit of challenge. And yeah, that's I think I'm coming towards the end of my session. So it's coming, it's big. You can see like we are talking about $3 trillion of off-balance sheet commitments in 2014. So it's really, it really has a worth that IASB has put in that much effort into this project. Yeah, it's really big, it's coming. And I think that's all from my side. Villain Dang, thank you very much. Bahut shukriya.
Thank you very much, Mr. Najmul Saqib, for this elaborate presentation. Whenever I see these lengthy standards, it only strengthens my belief that somebody out there at the IASB research department is doing his job really well to make our lives more and more difficult, personal and professional both. So I think that our next speaker is our session chairman, Mr. Aslan Khalid. He is a partner in Y as well as an accounting advisory services partner especially. So you may launch your questions to him as well for this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think, and first of all, many thanks to Najm for sparing your time, precious time in Pakistan for us to give this presentation, a very detailed technical presentation on such an important topic. Actually, IFRS 16, I think, as you all can see, is very significant standard and is going to have a very detailed implications on the way we structure our balance sheets. And it is not only the standard which will affect the assets and liabilities, it's actually affect the way we structure our financial models across various entities. Now, you can imagine that, in terms of if you like to visualize the impact in the context of Pakistan. Now, imagine the banks. All the banks have actually a chain of branches which are actually on lease, on a lease basis, on a rental basis, which may qualify as lease arrangements under IFRS 16. Currently, these all are treated as rent expense in the financial statements, and if all those branch locations actually are capitalized and reflected as right to use assets, I think that can significantly increase the quantum of the balance sheet for the banks. Go to telecoms. I think in telco, I think they are entering into various tower sharing arrangement where I think all the infrastructure assets, the passive infrastructure and the active infrastructure that those towers of mobile companies are shared between different telecom operators. Those sharing and rental arrangements may qualify as leases and therefore be reflected on the books of the telecom operators. And these can be very complex situations where the tower sharing may be regarded as a service arrangement or a lease arrangement depending on the terms of the lease. We have airline. I think PIA uses lots of lease arrangements. Some of them are recognized as assets, some are not, depending on the operating or finance distinction that we have. But I think after IFRS 16, most of those leases will qualify as assets and will be reflected entirely on the balance sheet. In our power sector, I think we have lots of all the capacity agreements that we have with the government of Pakistan puts us in a position of a lessor. The power companies are actually leasing the infrastructure that they have to the government of Pakistan, and they are actually acting, they are actually lessors of the assets to the government of Pakistan. Under IFRIC 4, that is also applicable currently. But I think the SECP has deferred the application or exempted the application of IFRIC 4 for power sector companies. Now, IFRIC 4 is part of IFRS 16. So IFRIC 4 will be embedded in IFRS 16, is actually embedded in IFRS 16. Now, this exemption will no longer be effective because IFRS 16 will come into force or will come into application as a one standard. So you cannot say that certain parts are exempted for certain sectors. So which means the IFRS 16 will bring with it the actually non-effectiveness of the kind of a waiver that we have from IFRIC 4, and the power companies will need to analyze how they're going to apply IFRIC 16 on their capacity arrangements that they have with the government of Pakistan. I saw there was one kind of a room available where it say this IFRS 16 will apply to all the new lease contracts, not to the previous contracts that were entered into. So even for the new power sector companies that are being set up, and there are many, they have to actually apply the new IFRS 16 on their infrastructure assets that they have acquired or they will build in the future, which is actually entirely a different financial model as compared to the current financial model where all the power plants are reflected as fixed assets on the balance sheets. So suddenly those fixed assets will be replaced by a receivable, a long-term receivable from government of Pakistan, and you can imagine how big this would be a change for the power sector. So all in all, I think this standard, which will bring, I think, not a very new concept, because the concept of what is a lease and what is a service was already to some extent was covered under IFRIC 4, which is the interpretation of IS 17. But I think this standard will still bring in with it a lot of kind of complexity when it will be applied in 2019. SSCP has already adopted the standard to be effective from 1st of July 2019. Additional complexity in our scenario is the Ijara contract. I think somebody raised. Ijara contract is an Islamic way of leasing, and we have actually a position where we have got Islamic accounting standard and IFRS both operative at the same time. So the transactions which are done in an Islamic way actually are accounted for under Islamic accounting standard, Ijara. So typically looking at the contract, although I think a contract or accounting is neither Islamic nor non-Islamic, accounting is accounting, but I think the way legally it is structured is that if the contract meets the definition of Ijara and it qualifies and it contains all the ingredients of the Islamic finance Ijara arrangement, then it has to be accounted for under the Ijara contract accounting that we have under the Ijara standard. If the contract do not meet the Ijara definition, then obviously it is a conventional lease and it would have to be accounted for under IFRS 16. Although Ijara standard itself actually, which is based on operating lease concept, may change because the Islamic organization AOFI is also looking at all its standards to be revised to be in line with IFRS. So maybe in future we'll see a change in the Ijara standard, and which will be more in line with IFRS 16 going forward. But I think till that happens, Pakistanis will have a window of opportunity available to use Ijara as a mechanism to reflect the leases as operating leases. Maybe that is an avenue which is available to show the leases or continue to show the leases as operating off balance sheet rather than on balance sheet. So I think we will have our share of complexities when the standard will be applied in 2019, but my advice and suggestion is that this is not only a standard which will require your technical evaluation and expertise, but also some logistics and also a lot of data gathering, etc., to visualize the actual impact on the balance sheet. And also we have tax complications because the expense, the operating lease expense will be spread in a different way under the IFRS 16. Currently, if it's an operating lease, normally it's a straight line way of recognizing the expense. But now under IFRS 16 is going to be an IRR-based split of the lease rental over the term of the lease, which means more expense in the initial years and lesser expense in the years after, which is going to have some tax implications because in the initial years, the entities may be subject to a higher tax rather than currently. So those are the actually issues which can only be considered or evaluated when actually you have a complete data available for to actually to determine how much and how many are your lease contracts and whether they are service contracts or lease contracts, and if all of those contracts are capitalized, how the balance sheet would look like. It's not the current balance sheets, it's going to be the future balance sheets as well, because every company has business plans for future, financial plans for next 5 years, 3 years. So to your boards, to your stakeholders, if you make a presentation about the future financial results, you need to take into consideration that the accounting will be different in the future years, and therefore those aspects need to be considered in any financial model that you develop for your company. So with that, I think I thank you all for joining us today in this very important session at ICAP, and I'll just like now to invite, I think, the president of ICAP, that Mr. Riaz Rahman, with us to give some of the memento to our guest and speaker, Najmun Saqib. So, but before we do that, I think if you have any further questions, I think, and you didn't find an opportunity to ask those questions, I think we still can take those questions if anyone is interested, I think. No questions means, I think, should we take this as a green signal to, before do the memento ceremony and then obviously wrap up the event. So I think I invite Mr. Riaz Rahman to come to the stage and also Najam to take the memento.
Thank you very much. I'll invite Mr. Riaz Saab to actually give a piece of memento to Aslan Saab as well as a speaker. Please give a big round of applause for our speaker, Aslan Khalid. Thank you very much for this, for participating in our session. I think this is a very technical area and it requires more and more time and more these kind of sessions. And I think a number of sessions will definitely elaborate and clarify more on these technical intricacies of these ideas. So without any further wait, I would like you to join with us on the high tea as well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.